G'day. Let's talk about tactical voting. What is it? Should you use it? Last week I made a video that I titled Why Putting Labor number 1 Could Help the Liberal National Coalition Get Back into Government. Lots of people loved it. A few people thought it was rubbish. I wasn't 100% happy with the feedback, so I took it down. This video is a remake. Same info, some extra clarification, a little less biased, make everyone happy. Yeah, right. Anyway, let's go. Part 1. How is preferential voting counted? This is the background you need to understand tactical voting. In a federal House of Reps vote, you probably know that to make a valid vote, a voter has to number every box on the ballot in order of their preference from 1 until the last box is filled. But do you know what happens after that? Here's how it works. The ballots are divided between the candidates based on the number 1 votes. If someone gets 50% of the votes, they win. Simples. If no one gets 50%, the candidate with the least votes is excluded, and their ballots distributed based on what the voters wrote as their second choice. If someone has 50% of the votes now, they win. Otherwise, we keep doing the same thing. Exclude the candidate with the least votes and distribute those ballots to candidates still in the running based on the voters' preferences. We just keep doing this until someone has more than 50% of the votes. If we get down to 3 candidates and still no result, we eliminate the candidate in third place. In a close race, we'll often exclude all of the candidates except for 2, and then whoever has the most votes definitely has more than 50%, so they win. Part 2. What is tactical voting? Tactical voting is when a voter doesn't put the candidate who they'd most like to win as their first preference, and instead put another candidate as number 1 for a tactical reason that they think will affect the outcome in a way that benefits them. In Australia's House of Reps voting, the most likely reason you do this is because you very strongly want a particular candidate to lose, and you believe that someone other than your favourite candidate is more likely to beat that candidate if it comes down to a 2-candidate one-on-one preference count. By giving that alternate candidate a higher preference, you increase the chance that they are one of the 2 left standing at the 2-candidate point, instead of your favourite candidate. So you might be a huge Spider-Man fan, but if someone had to fight the Hulk, and you could only choose one superhero to send in against him, you might choose Iron Man. Spider-Man's still your favourite, but you really don't want the Hulk to win, and you think Iron Man's got a better chance of winning, so you send in Iron Man. Now Iron Man might win, or he might not, and you're not completely convinced that Spider-Man couldn't win, but you're pretty sure that Iron Man's got a better chance than Spider-Man, so you send him into the fight. That's how someone choosing to do tactical voting would vote in Australia's House of Reps, assuming the candidate they really don't want to win is going to make it to the top 2. They give their first preference to the candidate they think is most likely to win against that candidate. They put aside the goal of maximising the chance of their favourite candidate winning to focus on the alternative goal of maximising the chance of someone else they really don't like losing. Part 3. Doesn't preferential voting make tactical voting unnecessary? Simple answer is no. Someone proved with maths that tactical voting can always affect the outcome of practically any vote with more than 2 options. The longer answer is that our preferential voting makes it less necessary to consider tactics when voting to get acceptable outcomes, but it's not altogether irrelevant. But really the biggest reason it doesn't come into play very often in Australian politics is because most of the time in most of the seats the final one-on-one battle is Labor versus Liberal or Labor versus National, and whoever came in third wasn't even close to having enough votes to make it to the final 2. But this election is different. Part 4. Why is this election different? What's different this election is that there is a huge number of moderate independents. These are centrist candidates, not members of any party, who are pulling votes away from Liberal, away from National, and away from Labor. They are promising science-based action on climate change, serious commitment to political integrity, and better representation for members of their community who feel that what's going on in Canberra doesn't represent them. Part 5. Why do moderate independents make tactical voting more relevant? These moderate independents have been garnering a lot more mind share and support than is typical of a minor party or independent campaign, attracting voters away from the 2 biggest parties. That means there's a real chance that some, or even many of them, could be in the final 3 candidates when preferences are being distributed, and have a real shot at being in the final two. And because they're pulling voters from both sides of Australia's political spectrum, it creates the conditions where some level of tactical voting could have a very significant effect on the outcome. Let's have a look at a hypothetical scenario. Let's assume that a seat that is currently held by the Coalition has got down to 3 candidates: Labor, Moderate Independent, and Liberal or National. Let's first consider a situation where the Indie has slightly less votes than the Labor candidate, so they're excluded, and their preferences get distributed. Because they're pulling votes from Labor and LNP, I think it's reasonable to assume that some of the independent voters will have put Liberal or National as their number 2 preference. That means some of their preferences will head back out in each direction. In a tight race, especially if LNP is already ahead, those preferences could put them over the line for a win. Notice that if we get to this point, whether or not Labor voters have put an independent as number 2 has no consequence. The independent is already excluded. Because Labor made it to the top 2, the rest of the preferences on the votes in their pile don't have any bearing on the outcome. But let's wind it back and assume the Indie gets slightly more votes than Labor in the 3-way race. Now Labor is excluded and their preferences distributed. Here I think it's reasonable to assume that most Labor voters would preference an Indie over Liberal or National, so most of these votes will go to the Indie, and that might put them over the line. So you can see in this hypothetical scenario how a moderate independent, because they've pulled some votes away from the LNP, could have a chance of beating the LNP in a one-on-one battle when Labor couldn't beat them in the same battle. In fact, if we accept the assumptions, and they are assumptions, that firstly, Indies will have significant number 1 votes that have Liberal or National as number 2, and secondly, Labor voters will typically preference an Indie above LNP, then it would always be the case that the Indie has a better chance at beating the LNP than Labor. That doesn't mean Labor couldn't win, just like we didn't assume that Spider-Man couldn't beat the Hulk. It's very possible they may have attracted enough swinging voters, or upset LNP voters, that tactical voting isn't necessary to push the LNP out of the seat. But only one candidate gets to go head-to-head in the final counting round, and I think there's good reason to believe Indies will have a better chance of winning. But, as we've just seen, the independent only gets the opportunity to be in that final round if they have more votes than Labor at the 3-candidate point. They might get enough votes from people who think the independent is their most favourite candidate to represent them and give them their number 1. But they are more likely to get there if some Labor voters decide to use tactical voting to maximise their chance of getting rid of their Liberal or National MP. What it really comes down to is Labor supporters deciding that rather than maximising the chance of Labor winning, they're going to team up with the ex-Liberal and National voters who've given the independent a number 1 to maximise the chance of the LNP losing. Part 6. Where will tactical voting make a difference this election? Which seats is Labor likely to lose but an independent can win? There's a very simple answer to this one. We don't know. We won't have the information to answer that question until all the votes have been counted. What we do know, though, is that there's 15 seats where a moderate independent is running against a sitting coalition MP with backing from Climate 200 and from people in their community. Of those 15 seats, only 1 has been won by Labor this century, and about 2/3 of them have never been won by Labor in the 50-year history of the seats. After the last video I made about this, I had several people tell me that based on polling, Labor is almost definitely going to win some of these seats. And that's fine. People are entitled to make their own observations and form their own opinions. And polling definitely has a place to play in making a decision about whether you think tactical voting is likely to give you a better outcome. Personally, I don't place much confidence in polls, and I think a lot of other people have less confidence in them after the last election result was so different to the pollsters' predictions. If you're considering tactical voting, it's a good idea to be aware of polls, but also to remember that they don't tell you exactly what will happen on election day. Part 7. Should you use tactical voting in your electorate? Again, it's a simple answer. That's your decision. There's no right or wrong answer. If you want to maximise the chance of Labor winning your seat, of course you should put them at number 1. If we had a working crystal ball, we could see from the future election results in which seats tactical voting could have changed the outcome to the one that you preferred. But we don't have one. We just have the awareness that if you're in a marginal or safe LNP seat and you've got a moderate independent candidate, giving Labor your number one might have the effect of pushing the independent out of the race, which would, if my assumptions about preferences are correct, give the coalition candidate a better chance of winning than if they had to face the independent in that final round. Again, we don't have enough information to say whether this hypothetical situation will occur in any particular seat or not, and the statement that the Indy probably has a better chance at winning against an LNP candidate doesn't imply that Labor can't win the seat from the LNP candidate. We're just talking about them having a better chance. The problem is we won't get the information we need to know the difference until after we all have to make the decision on our ballots. So, now that you know about tactical voting, you may choose to focus on maximising the chance of LNP losing. If you really want to get rid of your coalition MP, and you're not too fussed on whether they're replaced by a Labor MP or an independent, then you might want to consider giving a moderate independent your number one preference as a tactical vote. Let's wrap this up. Tactical voting is not misinformation. It doesn't encourage people to make an invalid vote that won't be counted. It doesn't tell people to vote for someone they don't want. Educating people about it is not an attempt at deceit, and it's not irrelevant in Australian politics. Tactical voting simply presents voters with an alternative perspective to use in choosing where to put the highest preference on their ballot. It highlights that in some seats, in some elections, you might want to vote differently depending on whether you want to maximise the chance of your favourite candidate winning or maximising the chance of someone you don't like losing, even if that means your favourite candidate might not win. I believe there's a real possibility that tactical voting could make the difference in some seats at this election, between Labor losing to a Liberal National candidate and an independent winning against a Liberal National candidate. Unfortunately, my crystal ball is broken right now, so I can't tell you whether your electorate is one where it might make a difference. You'll need to make that call yourself. If you found this useful, please share it around. Happy voting. Please stay safe and wear a good mask to the polling booth, and enjoy your democracy sausage.